Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Pursuing Truth. It's great to have so many of you online with us on Zoom. That's going to be really helpful during the Q&A section. And to those who are watching again, you are so welcome. Please do get in touch if anything happens tonight, anything is said that really influences or impacts you. We would love to follow up with you on that. So tonight we're going to be looking at mental health. What does it mean? What's the interplay between mental health and Christianity? You know, what's our theological understanding and our pastoral response to mental health in the church and beyond the church as well, for that matter. This evening we've got a great panel. We've got Matt Banks, who's going to bring more of our theological understanding to light. We have Emma, who's coming from a medical background, so she's going to be really helpful in that regard. And we have Colin Cooper. For those of you who know Keith, you are not seeing double. This is Keith's, I would say, marginally better looking twin. You know. And Colin is a counsellor, and it's going to be really beneficial to have his insight into our kind of pastoral response to mental health in the church. So at this point, although I've done a very brief intro, I'm just going to ask each member of our panel to just give a little bit of an introduction of themselves, what they do, and yeah, then we'll move into our actual evening. So just before we do the format of this evening, it's about 45 minutes of open discussion between the members of the panel, and then 45 minutes of question and answer. So you will have a chance to unmute and actually get involved at some point this evening. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Matt. So Matt, introduce yourself.
Everyone. So I imagine the majority of people will know me, apart from perhaps Colin and a few others. So I'm one of the other leaders who head up Pursuing Truth, which is a forum really, which seeks to develop good conversation between both, well, within Christianity, but also Christianity and cultures surrounding it, all in the pursuit of truth. And we believe it's a good thing to know truth, to be conformed to it, and so on. And yeah, so we've been doing that now for maybe a year or so, just over that. I'm also one of the leaders with Keith and Dave and others at Freedom. And I am married, 4 kids, social support work full-time, have been lecturing with the Light College for 3 or 4 years, although this year was my last year, lecturing in theology, mainly in apologetics. That's probably enough from me.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. Emma, if you could just give us a little bit of your background.
You can hear that's a motorbike just going past outside. I'm Emma. I am a doctor. I qualified in medicine in 2005, and I worked briefly as a GP trainee, and then I became unwell. And the short version is that I retrained as a teacher and worked in that, and I now work teaching in a medical school. So I have had experience of helping and treating people with mental illness. I did a psychiatry job as part of my training, and I've had mental health issues myself, and now I spend a lot of time doing pastoral work and helping medical students. I'm the head of year 2 at the University of Liverpool Medical School, so that's kind of where I'm coming from into the debate.
That's great, thanks, Emma. And finally, but not by no means least, Colin, how you doing?
Yeah, good to be with you. Yeah, I always say to people, I actually, first and foremost, I'm a farmer. That's my background, and did agriculture after I left school. Year 2000, I went to Bible College and studied, and again, then after 3 years, and so for the last 17 years, I've been pastoring in 2 churches. I suppose what about a year and a half ago, I stepped down from church life to basically pastors is probably the best way of describing it. I basically support pastors in the Association of Baptist Churches, travel around, meet up with them, and so that's my sort of my full-time role as such. Also as well, I'm going back a number of years ago, probably about 6 years ago, I did some counselling training as well. So started off CBT training, then moved into integrated training course over the last couple of years, and then did some youth and adolescents training as well. So I'm BACP registered counsellor. So alongside what I do with churches and pastors, pastors also refer people on to me in their churches for counselling as well. So we do quite a lot of that. My week sort of is half and half with pastors, half and half counselling. Do some other stuff as well, some teaching and lecturing and evangelism training and all sorts of stuff as well, quite other things as well. But over the past 6 years, I've worked in a foundation in Dungan that works with suicide and self-harm. And so still linked in there, doing probably quite a bit less than I used to. Now I see most people I see now are via the church, or private, or also help out with there's a charity up in Clocker that I work with as well, counselling as well. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of a brief view of what I'm up to.
That's great, thank you. And I'm Dave, just for those who don't know me. I also am one of the leaders at Freedom Church alongside Matt. My job tonight is not so much to be a panel member, but to keep the conversation going, introduce questions. However, mental health is something that I also have experience with, as many of us do. So there may be points where I'll chime in a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I have testimonies of God's healing in that regard. And I also have testimonies of times where I felt like God was completely missing in action. And so I think both of those areas are something that is important to address as well. So now you've met everyone, let's crack on. So our first question, just to start things off, is this: how do we begin to think about what mental health actually is? How does the Bible or Christian tradition help us in our understanding? Who's going to kick us off on this one? I'm going to throw to you, Matt.
Okay, so I did a little bit just of a rummage around just to see what kind of definitions I could find. Firstly, like non kind of biblical definitions. So this was one that came up, which I'm not saying I agree with, but just to throw out there, it might be helpful just to start something, which is that mental health includes our emotional and psychological and social well-being. Okay, in terms of that's like the essence of the definition there, from a mental health website, that is. And then just goes on to talk about how it affects basically all then other areas of life. So the focus is the psychological and emotional areas, but then as a result of that being the case, whatever issues we're having in those areas seep into all that we think, we say, and we do. It goes on to say. I think that's fairly helpful, I would suggest, as a starting point, just to think about what it is. Something that I am still trying to, I guess, work out, which might be a good place for us to start, is biblically speaking, mental health, as far as I'm aware, isn't a category, at least not in those terms. And often, if those who are online are aware of at least some of the teaching within the Christian tradition, the heart is spoken of a lot. And the heart is seen as almost the seat or the center of the human person, which is influencing quite a lot of how we think and how we feel and also what we do. And so actually, one of the questions I've got is, are those definitions, or is the heart basically being explored from the website's perspective? I think they're probably very close, but I'd love to know what Emma and Colin think on that, or the role of the heart in this conversation of mental health.
I think when obviously from a biblical perspective, you talk about the heart, or actually I think that some of the original Greek is actually talks about the intestines, actually, is the seat of emotion. And we actually does heart in the English translation. And it's that idea of feelings, emotion. I think it's certainly rooted in scripture. And I suppose going back into your initial definition, I suppose that the one thing I always point out when we talk about mental health, it's a very obvious thing, but sometimes we miss it because we quite often use mental health as a negative thing, but it's not, because we all have mental health. Either mental health is good mental health, or else our mental health is poor, or we're somewhere. I think, to be honest, we're all somewhere on that spectrum. Either it's we're top of the world, or else we're in depth of despair, or else generally we're somewhere in the middle, in between there. And certainly I think you see the range of that even biblically as well, just with throughout scripture. And the way I suppose tend to look at human beings is that there's 4 parts to us. So there's the physical, there's the emotional. I'll tend to also divide the emotional and the thoughts as 2 separate parts. So our feelings and our thinking are separate things. That's probably coming from my CBT background, to be honest with you. And then obviously the spiritual. So there's 4 parts to us, and they're all interlinked. So if one part is off, everything feels off. The illustration I quite often use is if you wake up tomorrow morning, you've got a toothache, physical pain. So what happens is, well, actually your mood goes down because you've got a toothache. So your emotions are affected. Not only emotions are affected, your thoughts affected too. You're going to think, I've got to arrange to go to see the doctor. You hate the doctor, don't want to go to see the doctor. And so your thoughts are affected as well. And then you go to read your Bible and think, I'm too much pain, can't be bothered reading my Bible. And so there's a spiritual impact on your life to some extent as well. So everything's interlinked and feeds in together there.
Yeah. How do we distinctively separate mental health as something apart from just general experience in the world as a whole person, right? Because I think that's what you're kind of getting at, right? Is that physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, like we're whole people, and we have experiences which affect us on each of those kind of, I don't know whether you want to put it as circles concentrically, or levels, whether spirituals at the bottom, I don't know. But how do we talk about mental health as something kind of specific, as a thing? Do you get what I'm trying to say? As apart from just life and experience, and we just experience sometimes really positive moments, sometimes they're sustained, but sometimes dark moments which are sustained as well. And so I'm just trying to grapple with, is it helpful even to separate just mental health as a specific thing, or is it actually just life? Emma, I don't know whether you want to come back at anything there.
I think my perspective on it is that I like Colin's definition of the 4 areas, and they're all interlinked, and the analogy of the toothache's a good one. I would say from a medical perspective that what tends to happen is that we can all experience time. We take depression as an example, because there's lots of different mental health issues, but depression is an interesting one to talk about. If you're put under certain stresses or strains, some of us will experience that in our emotions. But there are some people who are put into certain conditions who will experience something that's quite profound and sustained. And then it starts to become something that is different from that almost normal spectrum, in a sense that it is along that spectrum somewhere, but a psychiatrist or a GP would say, this is actually something that we would say is an illness. And actually, one of the things that people often don't realize about depression is it's a profoundly physical illness.
Yeah.
So it affects our bodies, but also what is going on inside my skull here in my brain. You can tell, if you take brain samples from people and look who are depressed, you can tell from the concentrations of neurotransmitters that they are. Obviously, we don't do that because that would be a bit of an invasive, and we haven't done it often. People have done experiments where they've done it. So doctors diagnose depression on what the patient tells them and also what they can see is going on with them. So there is something very, very, very different. And that's just put in the chat. You can actually tell from MRI scans that different areas of the brain are shrunk down when somebody's had depression for a period of time. So it's very, very much, there are ways to be able to go, that's what depression looks like. So there's a difference. And I think, so therefore, depression as an entity sits in all four. It's got a physical aspect, it's got a mental aspect, it's got an emotional aspect, and it's got a spiritual aspect. So I think it's important. And I'm not sure that separating it out is particularly helpful.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to talking about recovery, which we'll probably get on to some later on, I mean, recovery involves all four. It's looking at all those four levels, how we begin to interact with people in those four ways.
So Emma, as from a medical perspective, I'm assuming the medical definition of mental health. So let's take depression as an example. Would be less holistic than Colin's definition there. Would I be right in thinking that?
Not particularly. I mean, we increasingly doctors are in. I mean, sometimes the definitions don't include the spiritual. Increasingly, they do, because there is a lot of recognition that you know, if a patient has a faith, then it's important to include that in how you care and look after them. There are more sort of clinical textbooky definitions of saying that somebody's had low mood and motivation for X amount of time on most days, and that there are sort of ways of, you know, classifying it. But generally the approach, and often it takes quite a while to come to a diagnosis of depression. Often GPs will code it as low mood for a long time before they actually come to a decision that that is what is going on. So increasingly, Dave, I would say it's in line with what Colin has said.
Okay, I think that's from my perspective, I find that really encouraging.
It's also really instructive and helpful in that, as we've been talking about, you know, very often I think when we are experiencing grief or trauma or depression, or you know, the whole spectrum, I guess we could be thinking of here, we very naturally and impulsively, like, we want a quick exit from this, don't we? We want an answer to it, and actually framing it helpfully in that we've got, you know, humans are complex beings. There's a number of different areas interplaying simultaneously. That helps us at least approach it, I think, wisely, because whereas perhaps we want to, if we are experiencing that ourselves, we want that quick exit. If we see a loved one, you know, who, or even somebody who's come to us and says they're experiencing some kind of mental health issue, then it helps us know that actually, as much as we want to say, oh, I think we've found it, the process could be quite a long one in discovering what really is behind what's going on. It could be a variety of things, of course, but I think what comes to mind is normally a lot of things that we tend to say when we're experiencing are just kind of those thoughts, and don't really sometimes get at what's going on underneath. And it takes time to be able to explore that with somebody, because we can't just unpack weeks and weeks and months and sometimes years worth of particular experiences, feelings, values, visions, all of these things which then play into mental health.
Yeah, very much so. If I'm out for a walk and I see a tree, I see it because I see the trunk and I see the leaves. Actually, if I'm going to address why there's a tree there, I need to dig down in order to see the roots. And I think it's very much like that with mental health, isn't it? Again, we're just going to let's just agree to default to depression for now, just for the sake of ease. In my experience, I felt awful, but it was actually Laura who noticed it, and what she noticed was the symptoms. The root cause, it turns out, was, I've only recently come to understand that it was undiagnosed ADD and being somewhere on the ASD spectrum as well. So it does take time, and often the person who is suffering with depression, cannot identify the root cause for it, and that is deeply frustrating. And it actually only serves as a feedback loop for your emotional state. That's just in my experience. But also, let's bring this into a Christian context now. So, as a believer, I can tell you, I was almost willingly in denial that I had depression, for a number of reasons. First off, surely for me as a Christian, to be depressed is a failure to trust God with my worries. So let's move on to our next question.
Oh,
Dave, we've lost your audio.
You're on mute, Dave.
Hey, here we go. There was always going to be at least one problem, wasn't there? So our second question tonight is there a relationship between sin and mental health? Which, again, as a Christian who was struggling with mental health, I was afraid to ask for help in that, because I thought that people would look at me and say, well, Dave, there's sin in your life, you're not trusting God, like it was my fault. I'm going to throw that to Colin. How have you experienced that kind of attitude before?
Yeah, I mean certainly there's a number of folk go down that road, and I mean, in one sense, it's the answer to that question is kind of complex as well, because the answer is can it be sin? Well, actually, sometimes it can be, because I mean a huge thing that you see with mental health is the layer of guilt over something past that somebody has done in their life, and they can't forgive themselves for it, and so they're wrestling with that. Now, of course, we believe that the only solution to that obviously is forgiveness, and ultimately the forgiveness that God brings in the Lord Jesus Christ. So that can be part of it. So you get guilt, you have anger, you have bitterness that comes along sometimes with that. However, when it comes to obviously to counselling someone, that tends to be the last place I go, because normally when you're counselling somebody, somebody with depression, for example, they don't need to be told that they're worthless, because they feel absolutely worthless already. So I mean, I will never go there with someone. I will explore it very, very gently after I've been with them for quite some time. Unless they bring it up initially themselves, say, okay, this is something in my life that I'm really struggling with. So I mean, what I do most often with people is I'm saying to them, actually, this might not be a sin problem. This is probably an emotional problem you're going through. This has nothing to do with sin in your life at all. I spent a lot of time talking about the grace of God with particularly if somebody's coming from a Christian background, because they need to understand forgiveness. Sometimes they cannot forgive themselves. They cannot believe that God would forgive them either. And that whole area of grace is huge and so important. And so I mean, I think over these past number of weeks, I've had about, I think, at least 5 or 6 people I've counselled, and I've used that phrase with them. I don't think this is a sin problem. I think there's an emotional problem, and we will deal with the emotions. God has not left you. You have not walked away from God. You know, do you still love God? I usually ask them, they say, yes, I do love God. Have you brought what you're going through before God and prayed and you have done that? And I said, okay, right, you've noticed that you've got an emotional problem here. Let's deal with the emotions. The spiritual will sort itself out, because actually God hasn't changed, and actually I don't think you've changed in your relationship with God either. I think there's also a third area to this as well, is the whole area that we don't sometimes talk about too much, is the idea of being sinned against. Somebody who's been sinned against, and so somebody's come and they've done something horrendous to him, whether it's abuse, whether you know, of whatever sort it happens to be, or something else, and that whole area of being sinned against, and how we deal with that. And obviously the Bible deals with that, I think, sometimes better than the church does at times. You know, the idea of sort of brokenness that needs healing. You know, idea of being defiled that can be cleansed. You know, that idea of injustice and justice, and those kind of terms, and you know, very often the gospel biblically is described in those terms as well. We tend to very often describe the gospel in sort of the idea of repentance and forgiveness, which is well, it's biblical, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but also sometimes with people we need to sit down and talk about brokenness and healing, and or defilement and being cleansed, and you know, when they're being sinned against as well.
I think what I would pick up on that is, when you're talking to somebody who is in the midst of a depression, the other thing to understand about depression is it's a cognitive illness as well as a mood illness. In fact, in some ways, it's more so that than a mood illness. It's got labeled as being about mood, but actually, you know, when I've been extremely depressed, my ability to think and form thoughts is very, very it's very difficult. So doing anything, reading my Bible, praying, those sorts of things are difficult. And also people will sometimes become convinced that because you feel worthless and you feel nothing, you feel really sinful, and you have that going on. And in essentially in a counselling relationship, you need someone like Colin to say, I don't think that's what this is, because there's a tendency to go down that route. One of the books that I really like on it, which again is out of print, unfortunately, but is a really good one. It's written by a Christian GP, called A Practical Workbook for the Depressed Christian, which I've got. And one of the things that he says in the first chapter of the workbook, when he's talking to the depressed Christian that he is counselling through the book, as it were, is you don't have to read your Bible or pray tonight, which might sound like a very counterintuitive thing to say to a Christian. But what he says is, you don't need the points. God is not angry with you. You are in this place. You've got this problem with you know, you're not well, and that there is a sense of having to accept that. And when I read that, when I first got this book, that was profoundly comforting. Because when you read your Bible and you're in that place, you can read into it all of the negative and none of the positive, because what's going on in your mind prevents you from doing that. So you need somebody to come alongside you and almost say, let's look at some of the things like Colin pointing out grace and talking about grace, so that we don't talk about the repentance too much, because otherwise you're just repenting and repenting and repenting, and actually you're just stuck in this cycle. And actually that's not where you need to be. Yes, we need to repent when we sin, and if there is a root of sin in it, that needs dealing with, but really that needs dealing with when they're a bit better and they've got a little bit more of their cognitive function has come back. That would be my take on it.
I was just going to say there, just to pick up on the repentance, I said to somebody last week, that would you please stop repenting? You know, God's heard it the first time around.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I would agree with a lot that's just been said, if not everything. I think what came to mind firstly in a more theological, I guess, slant is, and on a personal level, something I was profoundly I guess, shocked at in myself when I've had kind of bouts of depression, but only not significantly at all. I was, I think there's only been about 2 times I would say that there's been periods that might be classed as it. I was shocked at part of my thinking on sin, which is, I think sometimes we can think of sin just as us acting directly against something that God has said. However, like, it shocked me in that I hadn't really begun to think that actually the scripture's definition of sin is much larger and wider than that, in that I think if we understand sin broader, it helps contextualize the reason as to why I'm going through this. It helps reset expectations in a number of ways. Firstly, actually, in a fallen world, in a world which isn't in its ideal state, which is broken and fractured in enormous ways, that should set our expectations a little bit perhaps better, in that we should expect to suffer. And it's not to say that we look for it. It's not to say, that we go out on the hunt for it. But I think it's only a matter of time before we have a negative mental health problem, or we are experiencing some kind of suffering, grief. We should just kind of expect it. And that's just the default view in a fallen world. But something I found quite significant in myself was that I don't think I had comprehended. I thought I was better than that. In other words, there was a part of me where I was like, actually, I shouldn't be like this. In other words, so that expectation hadn't seeped in enough for me. I hadn't quite got there. I thought I was immune. You get so far in the walk with God, and then some, you're somehow beginning to become immune to what it means to be human. And actually, like, that was just twisted thinking, which was done by sin. So although I wasn't, in any sense kind of at that point acting against him directly, I was still saturated in sin, in the sense that my expectations were formed from a wrong perspective, and that needed adjustment. And God in his kindness, provided it. But I think it's not only those actions, although they're definitely going to be there. Sin is also that framework, and actually just a fallen world is the very context in which should kind of set our expectations, or at least a lot of them. Does that make sense? Sorry, that was a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with what you're saying, in that we should, in a fallen world, we are not immune as believers to mental health problems. We should expect them, in the same way that I expect that I will probably stub my toe before the week is out, because I've just moved house and there's boxes everywhere. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm absolved from the responsibility of moving those boxes where I can. But I can still expect to be hurt. But it's not to say, oh, well, if you have a mental health issue, just accept it and deal with it. Just live with it. We still seek to be healed in one sense or another, don't we? We still seek to take steps to regain a good level of mental health.
Yeah, I've just, as Matt was speaking there, saying, I'm not meant to feel. There is actually a Christian CBT book, of which the title is "I Am Not Supposed to Feel Like This." That's the starting point that the author uses, because that's often a starting point that a Christian has when they realise they're beginning to experience that, is the guilt that what has sort of seep through about the Christian life and Christian tradition is that we're meant to be happy. And it can be a superficial understanding of what the joy of the Lord means. Because it doesn't mean being happy. You can experience the joy of the Lord and profound depression at the same time. It doesn't matter if you're not aware of that and you can't articulate that. There's no pressure for that. But I think if people have had that, they're more likely, I think, to go into the, I'm not supposed to feel like this. This isn't supposed to be happening to me. But as Matt said, it's all part of the fall, and physical illness and mental illness. You know, none of that existed prior to the fall. The world was perfect, and all of this, in a general sense, it is due to, you know, sin and sin coming into the world. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And as you say, you have a more profound encounter with that to realize, think, oh, I thought I was above this. I thought I wasn't going to experience this, when actually, yes, you do. So
yeah, and I think that a term that came into my head just then, that perhaps is helpful to bring up, it's just this a biblical notion, or a Hebrew notion, of shalom, right? In the original beginning, we're meant for this profound wholeness with ourselves, wholeness with others, wholeness with all creation, and wholeness with God. And this very discussion is kind of testament to the fact that that wholeness on multiple levels is not there. And yet it's something that we know that we want, that we still yearn for. And so we're trying to seek a way to navigate back towards that wholeness.
Well, if I can just segue into our next question and keep the conversation moving. We've got quite a few points to get through, and we're struggling on time here.
We can always do another session as well.
Yeah. So I think we were talking about this feeling of going, well, my emotions don't match up with what I know I should be feeling. I've heard it said, in fact, just this evening, someone said to me that emotions are like waves. You can't choose which ones come at you, but you do get a choice in which ones you choose to ride. You know, you can the waves come at you, and you can either surf them or let them go by. Now, I would say in general, that is probably a good summation of how we navigate through life. But, so our next question here is, can a person with mental illness be expected to be responsible for their emotions, actions, and choices? And if so, to what extent? Who's going to take this one?
I can start with this one. I think it depends on what mental illness we're talking about, partly. So one of the obvious ones is if somebody is experiencing what we call psychosis, where they have lost touch with reality completely, then it's very obvious, I think, to most people that are around them that they can't be held responsible because they're not in their right mind. And in a sense, that's easier because it's often very obvious that that's the case. And, you know, our response as a church community is to love that person and protect them as they go through that, and they come back to us, as it were. I think it's a trickier question when you're talking about things like depression and anxiety and that sort of diagnosis. I think in the analogy Dave's just given of being hit by the waves and being riding the waves, is that somebody who is experiencing depression will struggle to have the resilience to resist the emotions that they're experiencing. And we need to be mindful of that as we help them and deal with them. Because if it was as simple as that for someone who's depressed, then it would be pretty easy to avoid having depression. But it isn't, because there is a lack of control of what is going on up here. So, and the extent to which that's there, you need to have compassion, because, you know, people will say things like, well, you know, just cheer up. You know, it's you know, it's fine. Yeah. And also, you know, people have said to me, well, what have you got to be depressed about? Particularly when I was in one episode of depression was a reactive thing to a life event that I had that was very, very, my niece died, and it was an awful thing. It was very obvious to people, and people were almost, they could accept me being depressed after that happened. And then I've had episodes that have just hit me out of nowhere when life's been going really great. And people find it harder to go, well, what have you got to be depressed about? And that's because of a superficial understanding of depression being sadness, which it isn't. It involves sadness because that's how it expresses itself often. But it is to do with the brain chemistry not being right. And sometimes that happens to me for no apparent reason at all. And it's important to be able to have compassion about that, I think. So I think it varies with what is going on. But I think we need to take a stance of compassion, I would say, of the amount of responsibility that we expect people to have.
Yeah, I mean, one of the illustrations I use quite a lot to explain depression to either to families or else even just when I'm doing a presentation is that I put a lemon on the screen and ask people what colour the lemon is, and everybody says the lemon is
yellow.
Yellow. It is yellow. Yeah. Then I say, what I'm going to do next? I'm going to take a pair of glasses that have blue lenses in them. I'm going to give each one of you a pair of blue lens glasses and put them on, and then I put a filter over the lemon, so the lemon now looks green. So I ask the question again, what colour is the lemon? I mean, everybody says the lemon is green, at which point I say, no, it's not. What colour is the lemon? It hasn't changed. You're wearing blue glasses. The lemon is still yellow, hasn't changed at all. But for somebody who has depression, looking through the lens of depression, everything looks off colour. The past looks off colour, the present looks off colour. Actually, the future looks non-existent. I can't even see the future. It's not there at all. And it's just this, and no matter how much you say to that person, you know, look, your life is good, your life is, they can't take it in. They probably cannot connect with what you're saying. They can't see it for themselves. And so it's not about, as Emma said, it's not about sort of pulling yourself together. It's impossible to do that. And I think that anybody who's never struggled with depression really doesn't understand that. You know, we think we do, but we don't really. You know, we equate depression to having a bad day, which we basically do something nice and get out of after a day or two. That's not depression. That's just having it. That's just life. That's normal. Depression is different. And so, I mean, and that's the challenge, and that's the struggle. And as Emma said, depending where you're at. Now, certainly, given the other aspect too, obviously, the area I work quite a bit in is the area of suicide. Somebody who's suicidal, and you've got dissociation comes with that very often as well, and certainly in that really dark place where you discover that they can't look after themselves. So you're not going to give them responsibility. You're taking everything from them. You're saying, I'm going to care for you. I'm going to look after you. I'm going to be the one who makes decisions for you at this moment in time. You know, and there's a whole area of work. I'm not going into details, but a whole area of how you work through that with someone. So I'm not going into tonight. But you know, it's just important to realize where the person is at. And getting, I suppose, what you're doing is always trying to get to them to the place where they can start to take some responsibility alongside your support and alongside your help. The other illustration I use at that stage then is the idea of a long distance swimmer who's swimming, and he suddenly realizes after 15 miles of swimming that he's really tired and he's struggling, and so he says to his friends, if I keep going here, I'm going to die. You know, I'm going to drown. So his friend comes alongside and says, don't worry, I'll be in the boat beside you. You know, if you're hungry, I'll feed you. If you need lift out of the water, I will jump in and lift you out. That guy still wants to break the world record. So he does it all himself, but he knows there's always somebody there. There's always support. There's always somebody. So he's got to take some responsibility, but also he knows that if he can't, there's somebody going to pick him out of the water. So the two go hand in hand. Aside.
During one of the episodes of depression I had, I was partly, because another thing that can happen is paranoia. You become convinced that it or somebody is trying to get you, and you have a negative perception of everything. So I thought everybody in my family hated me. There was no evidence for that, and CBT helped me to see there was no evidence for that, but I felt that. And also just a profound deadening of thinking. I remember my mum once asked me if I wanted tea or coffee, and I burst into tears because I couldn't work out what the answer was. So it's about, and obviously when someone's at that stage, that is the time what Colin's saying is when the boat comes alongside and you feed somebody and you look after somebody and you sort of either literally or metaphorically put your arms around them, and at that point they cannot be responsible for what they're doing, and you need to take that, and as Colin says, you need to sort of put that back in as they start to recover. I mean, the interesting thing is, most people do recover from depression, even if they don't take tablets or even if they don't have any CBT input. If you leave somebody alone completely and they go around the life, they'll struggle, but they will get better eventually. That tends to be the natural cycle of it. But it, obviously, for most people, it's better to have some support. And for some people, sort of, I'm kind of drifting into the next question, I think, but for some people, medication, I would say, is an appropriate thing, but it depends on the person.
Yeah. And we are drifting into the next question just a little bit, but we've mentioned CBT a few times this evening. Can you just define what that is for those who don't know? Emma.
Oh, you want me to do it?
Yeah.
Well, I can, but I've got somebody that actually does it for their job, and I might get it wrong.
That would, you know what? That is a much better idea, isn't it? Sorry, Colin. Sorry, mate.
I mean, in basic terms, CBT is challenging your thoughts. Your basics are that your thoughts or your behaviour has an impact on your emotions. A lot of people think when you want to lift the mood or to reduce anxiety, reduce fear, you've got to focus on the emotions. Actually, by focusing on the emotions, you make everything worse. You focus on anxiety, you feel more anxious. So what we do is we challenge the thought or challenge the behaviour of the person. And so what we're always doing with the thoughts, we're always moving from a negative, we call it a negative automatic thought. Negative in the sense it causes negative emotions, automatic in the sense that it pops into your head uninvited. You don't want it there, but it comes anyway. You cannot control the first thought pops into your head, but maybe you might be able to control the second thought. If not the second, maybe the third. If not the third, maybe the fourth. You get the drift. And when you're always moving from a negative thought to a factual thought. So this idea of thinking positively, I'm counseling someone, I would tell them, says, I don't want you to think positively. I want you to think factually. You cannot keep a positive thought in your head, particularly if you're with depression, and maybe generally all the time anyway, but you can think factual thoughts in your head. So always moving from negative to factual. And what I like about CBT too is that you can bring in obviously biblical truth there. So moving from negative to truth. Truth thoughts, Bible thoughts, our identities in Christ. I mean, what a tremendous statement of truth.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
I mean, its adaptability to be biblical is one of its strengths, I think. And to give you an example, when I do, because once you've been taught how to do it, you can do it for yourself. So when I'm going through a bad patch, I remember being in the office and my colleague Faye, who's 2 computers down from me, and she's scowling. Because I was in a bad place, I thought, oh, Faye hates me. Faye's really angry with me. And what I do is I go, hang on a minute. What evidence is there that Faye hates me? Well, Faye made me a cup of coffee this morning and we had a nice chat. And Faye has probably had an annoying email and she's scowling at the email. So what you have to do is unpick what is happening. And when your mood is low, you tend to think the worst and think negatively. So it's about catching that and thinking factually, not trying to sort of jolly yourself up and thinking positively, but thinking about the facts, because her actual actions towards me were kind. And so therefore that would suggest that she doesn't hate me. So it can be, but there are times when it's really bad that doing CBT is exhausting. And sometimes you just need to not interact with people quite so much. Because you can't keep doing it because it's so hard. So you have to kind of get people to a place where, so that sometimes they just need to be at home with very little going on around them so that they can do this in a slow, measured way. So being at work would be too difficult. So it depends where the person is up to.
Yeah. Oh, go on, Matt. Oh, hang on. You need me to, don't you? Hey, there you go.
There you go. Thank you. It locked me out. Perhaps on purpose. It was, I think, something that I was reminded of, as both Colin and Emma have been speaking, is the importance of the fact that we're always interpreting the facts. We're never really getting the facts on their own. Whenever we receive either what people are doing or even perceiving how we're feeling, we're interpreting all of those all of the time. We never do that neutrally. So I think one of those steps is just like Emma was saying, is being aware at least of that fact. It can be really helpful that we're accepting facts usually, rather than just thinking that's definitely the way it is. And to be aware that actually our posture at that point is making us view a set of circumstances, or perhaps a way of feeling in a certain way, is kind of a big step forward. But then also, as Colin was saying about transferring CBT into a kind of a biblical place, that's also helpful in that in scripture and in the Christian tradition, we are then caught up in God's interpretation of us and what he says about the way things are. And so there's something extremely then fruitful and helpful, or not necessarily saying it's something instant, but by us allowing ourselves to be saturated in the much larger story, we're reminded kind of constantly of the way things are, and they can be very distinctly different to just how we're feeling, but being a part of that community, being a part of just us remembering certain things. And remembering is really important biblically as well. You see a lot of it in the Psalms, when there are people wrestling with deeply raw emotion. You see it in Jeremiah and Lamentations, you see it in Job, you see it in, pretty much across the whole board. Jesus's words, remember me. Remembrance, I think, is a key part in those times, remembering the way things have been before, remembering that there was a time where things felt profoundly different, where you believed things that were actually completely in contrast to how you think. They can all be remedial to an extent, for us beginning to work through and really to kind of bear mental health.
Yeah, I think just to try and move us on, I think we've got a couple of questions left, but I'm going to move on to the next question because I think it's really important, a really important aspect of the whole discussion between the interplay of faith and
should we do questions at past, Dave? I'm just thinking about making sure people have enough time. Is that all right? Or just finish off with this?
Let's just address this last one because I think it's really important. But before, what you were saying about perception and reality, there's a saying within CBT that the map is not the territory. And I think that's a really good way of understanding it. I can go on Google Maps and look at pictures of the Colosseum in Rome, but that doesn't tell me what it's like to stand in there. That doesn't tell me how hot it is. That doesn't tell me how many steps there are. And the reality is so much more multifaceted and very different to a simple, the map is not the same as the territory. But one of the things with CBT, it's cognitive behavioral therapy, isn't it? And Emma, you alluded earlier on that actually a lot of mental health causes cognitive dysfunction. So that kind of leads us on to our next question. So if you don't have that cognitive function, in light of 2 Peter 1:3, which I'll read now, which says, "His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who has called us by his own glory and goodness." So in light of that, should Christians seek counselling or a different psychological or psychiatric help, and what role should medicine take? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I think my view, unsurprisingly given the profession I chose, is that I think medicine is part of God's provision. I mean, God called me to be a doctor, so therefore it's always been quite natural for me to think that is part of God's provision to us. We seek help for cancer, we'd seek help for a broken leg, we'd seek help for other illnesses. So I don't see a major issue about seeking it for a mental health issue. And there are times, depending on how ill someone is, if someone is profoundly ill, they can't take part in CBT. So CBT wouldn't be appropriate for them. And for some people, medication or even electric shock therapy is the right thing for them to have in order to almost, nobody really knows how ECT works, but it basically defibrillates your brain. And then it seems to make some people start to actually be better. So I've seen, I looked after a lady, I used to administer the ECT when I was a doctor. And one lady I saw had sort of catatonic depression, which is when somebody is completely and utterly flat and they stare into space and you can't interact with them at all. I remember us giving it to her and her coming round from the anaesthetic, and she was still fairly not with it, but she smiled at me and asked for a cup of tea when she hadn't actually been able to interact before. So those sorts of therapies are really helpful in the very extreme sense. But I think counselling and taking medication is a very personal choice. And I think it depends on the place that the person is in and whether they want to do that or not. But I don't see a biblical problem with taking medication or having psychotherapy or CBT or whatever.
Yeah, I think I would fall exactly with you, Emma. I think the only issue that you could possibly get into with that verse is if you smuggle in the assumption that godliness equals not those things, which of course, you know, you don't need to do. Godliness, you know, I think it's like we've been saying kind of all evening, you can in many ways be godly and still have negative experiences in life. You can still have mental health issues and be godly, you know. So I think people who would want to use verses like that, I think, have to smuggle in an extra assumption in order for it really to want it to say that which they want it to say. I think I agree, Emma, as well. Like, I think it's a profoundly personal thing, and it's something that we, you know, you always in conversation with somebody, I would always perhaps take a slow road in making any of these decisions, which are very big and decisive. But I think counselling can profoundly help some people, and medicine, if appropriate, can profoundly help some people, especially if we keep in mind the fact that we're physical and biological beings as well as all the other areas that we are. It makes sense that if the physical sometimes impacts the emotional and so on, that if there's an issue there that can be addressed, then well, address it. Yeah, I think also something which was perhaps, I don't know, more towards the last question, I don't know, I feel like it's helpful here as well, is one of the things that makes it so hard to decide what to do, and probably encourages depression in some senses, is that there's so many opinions now as to the route out of it. I mean, the choices just in life that we have fill us with pressures that, you know, going back centuries, you probably wouldn't have had. Now, of course, mental health, depression, all those sorts of things were still there and caused by different things. But I think it's also good being aware that the internet and so on allows us to open ourselves up to zillions of voices, which can actually just numb us anyway. And so something I'd want to say is that we need to choose those voices well that we listen to. And as a Christian, of course, the Christian community, scripture and so on are going to be central to those voices, but also, when appropriate, those who are in counselling, those who can offer medicine and so on. So we need to choose carefully and wisely those voices that we listen to, because we just have so many now that are surrounding us.
Sorry,
Colin, were you going to add something there?
I was just going to say, yeah, I agree with everything that's been said there. I mean, I suppose only when I was thinking about the question, I mean, actually my thoughts went to Nehemiah and how God used an ungodly king to send Nehemiah to build the temple. You know, so when God uses people that we maybe think he shouldn't use sometimes. And I mean, even when it comes to counselling, I have no problem. I have a number of guys who train with me who are not Christians. I have no problem sending a friend to be counselled by them. You know, if they've been well trained, they should be able to listen well and talk about what they want to talk about spiritually, as well as anything else. You know, And back to what I said at the very start, that those 4 areas, the spiritual, emotional, the thoughts, and the physical. You know, I mean, I always say to people, get the right people around you. You know, so you want a pastor or a Christian friend to minister into your life if you're struggling. That deal with the spiritual stuff. You want, from the emotional, you want a good GP or a counsellor or a psychiatrist to come along, support you in that way. And that quite often does involve medication if you need it. I mean, as Emma said, you don't necessarily need medication to recover, but sometimes can be really, really helpful. Obviously, with your thoughts again. Good family and friends can do that. I have a guy who's a psychologist, and he always used to say, it's just the best form of counselling is sitting with a good friend with a cup of tea or coffee, if you prefer coffee, and having that, and somebody who listens well. So the thoughts can be challenged even with a friend. Obviously, a counsellor and CBT is really, really helpful. And actually preaching truth to yourself as well, alongside that too. And then obviously the physical, find a friend to go for a walk with, or a run with, or exercise with. If you do it with somebody else, you have more chance of doing it. Bringing in that exercise is really, really helpful when it comes to recovery.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the nervousness of some people is that, oh, if I'm going to a counsellor, if I'm using medication, it's somehow not being a good Christian, because once again, it's back to this kind of thought of, I'm supposed to rely on God and so on. And I think theologically understanding that is, well, actually, like, all truth is God's truth, no matter where we find it. A lot of it within the Christian tradition, but God is much bigger as well. And actually, if we hear truth from someone who's not a Christian but is true, we should take that and have it. If there's wisdom that's coming from a counsellor that's not necessarily Christian, but it speaks truth into your life, there's something that sheds light that you think is actually correct, you take it, because God's truth is his truth, and wherever it's kind of found. Now, obviously, I'd want a lecture time to kind of expand on that slightly and all sorts of nuances. However, I think it's just, that's the beginning steps of beginning to work out. It's not about dishonouring God in the way in which they're thinking.
No.
Well, we've got a couple of questions come through. So the first one is, how can, and I think actually, Colin, you've probably addressed some of this already in your previous answer. So how can or should we as Christians support those in mental distress? How do we best do that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that those 4 areas I think are key. So I would always encourage people to ask themselves sort of those sort of questions around those 4 areas. How can I come along and aside someone support them in those ways? I think the other thing as well is important to note. If you're coming to support somebody who's struggling with mental health, the chances are at some point they will push you away, or else you will not feel very welcome. And that's quite normal. So give them a wee bit of space and then pop round again. Encourage you to keep going back. Sometimes what happens is they're not naturally thinking in this terms themselves, but they're actually wondering, does this person really care? So they almost maybe subconsciously push you away to see, does this person care? Best if you do is go back and say hello again. You don't need to you don't have to the answers. You don't have to fix them. You don't have to do any of that. In fact, don't try to fix anybody, because it never works. Just be there for them and spend time with them, and go for the walk with them, have a cup of tea with them. People who ask you a lot of questions, they don't always want answers. They just want to ask questions. They just want you to listen. You don't need to answer their questions. And I mean, one of the counselling tools tools that's very, very helpful sometimes is just to allow somebody to talk and just reflect back their answer, or reflect back their question and let them talk, keep on talking. They don't want you to answer their questions for them all the time. That can be really annoying, actually.
It can be really annoying as well if you're always correcting somebody, like that. So it's that you could have someone who's just venting, and then you'll be like, well, why are you thinking like that? That's stupid. You just think, if you're constantly doing that to somebody, it's incredibly wearing. And Colin, you're right. They just want to vent. It's just that way of getting out this rawness of emotion or frustration or so I think like allowing that space is really, really important. It's essential. And I think as Christians sometimes we can get nervous because we like, particularly in the West, we like our doctrine, we like our we like people to be saying the things that we think they should be saying, and we get very nervous when someone, if they're in an emotional place, says something that you think, well, hang on a minute, like that's not how God works, or that's not, and we're all of a sudden trying to say, deal with heresy or something, and that's just not appropriate in that context. I think we need to allow space for somebody to say really sometimes unorthodox things, because it's part of their walking through and trying to get through what they're going through. C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed is a brilliant example of this, and I think I would really recommend somebody, don't read The Problem of Pain just yet, especially if you're somewhere in grief, but A Grief Observed is very different, qualitatively speaking, because he's just lost his wife. And it's insanely raw, really. And Lewis, again, after he's written it, goes back and qualifies it. But he says it's essential, nonetheless, that process was done. He says some things that as a, if you're not suffering from mental health and you're a Christian, you'd be like, oh, I'm not sure about that. Or in fact, that's dead wrong. But it's essential that Lewis went through that journey and to come out kind of the other side. Like Emma was saying, it does often happen that people do recover, but we've got to allow space for all kinds of things to be said, and for us not just to immediately jump on everything that is.
I had a friend who whose husband was a pastor, who came to see me one day. I was working from home ages ago, and she just rang me and said, I need to come round and see you. I said, oh, okay, come and see you. And she said, and I knew something was up, and she said, I don't think I believe in God anymore. And I went, okay, let's just talk about that, and talk about let's just talk and let her talk it through. And she's like, I can't say this to my husband because he will freak out if I say that, because their lives were built around their faith in God, and she was just in a place where she needed to express that. And the right thing to do is just, because you could jump down, well, he does, and he does, and these are the reasons why, but if you do that, you then just shut it down, and that's not what that person wants or needs. They just need to be able to go, okay, that's how you feel, and then start to try and explore, why do you feel like that? And she was experiencing depression, probably related to the menopause, but it's not jumping on it and doing the whole tick box of, we need to correct the theology and we must have all our ducks in a theological row. Life is messy, but God can handle that mess because he's God.
One of the things that when I was struggling that always used to aggravate me was when people would try and diagnose the root of what was going on, especially irritating as I had no idea myself. And obviously as Christians, our first, one of our major responses should always be prayer as well. When people come to us in mental distress, we should pray, but we need to be careful about how we do so. For example, I had one person who was trying to cast out all sorts of demons that they were convinced was responsible for my mental health. Now, that's not to say that there isn't that isn't a possibility in certain circumstances. We do believe in the supernatural realm, and that we have an enemy who is actively seeking to attack us. But I can tell you, even if that is the case, there are ways and times to do that kind of thing. And if you misjudge that, it can be deeply destructive. My advice would be, do pray for them. Sometimes literally with them in the room. More often than not, talk to God about them, and plead the Father for their sake in your own time, and let them know that you're doing that, because that is so encouraging to know that you're being lifted before God in your distress. but don't try and diagnose unless, you know, Colin is a trained counsellor. You know, it's his place to do that kind of thing. Don't try and be a counsellor if you're not trained as a counsellor. That can be deeply damaging. I'm not a mechanic, therefore I don't try and fix my car if it breaks down, because I will probably make it worse. There is, I think, as Christians, we think, oh, well, I've got the Bible, so I've got all the answers right there. Which, in a sense, yes. But also there is specialized training in these areas for very good reason. So yeah, stay in your lane, essentially is my advice as someone who's been on the receiving end of some, let's say, pastorally unhelpful prayers. Right, guys, let's move on to the next question. We do have one more question. So after years of having OCD and anxiety, is there a way out of it? And what's the best treatment for them to be able to have a normal life again?
It's a complex question.
It is a complex question.
It is.
And it's not one that we're going to be able to accurately, you know, adequately address in the next 15 minutes. But you go for it, Matt. Go on.
Well, it's complex in that the want I completely get. You know, again, it comes back to that. It's horrible to be fixated on things habitually, and that seems extremely draining, life-consuming, and so on. And so I'm aware that I'm speaking into something which I don't necessarily experience, but can identify just to some degree, but not by any means to the intensity. But I get that want to be out of it. I think one thing that we always need to be aware of is that there is hope. There is often ways out, but also there are no guarantees as well that you know, sometimes we can suffer with something and it's actually just the severity of something which diminishes, but actually it lingers for quite a while. And I think, again, part of readjusting our expectation, not seeing God so much as a vending machine, but as somebody who is walking with us through and in our suffering alongside us, and who is helping, perhaps in ways that we either don't want at the time or don't see at the time, I think is important, at least in just reminding ourselves of as we approach it. I think, I don't know whether Emma and Colin want to come in on this on a different angle, but in terms of my understanding of OCD would be it's linked to worry and perhaps over concern about a particular thing or things, and that actually that becomes a habit, which is quite difficult to break. I've got more thoughts on it, but I want to speak more informed in a more informed way. So before I say any more on that, to Emma or Colin, do you want to kind of chip in?
I mean, yes, there are lots of treatments for OCD, even if you've had it for a long time. And there is a school of thought that for some people, OCD has a profound and traumatic event or events in someone's life can manifest as OCD. And one of those can be people that have had abuse in their background, and that because it's sort of the way it's thought of psychologically is it's an attempt to control one's environment. Yeah. Because you've had something happened, if you've been violated in some way and you are trying to make sense of that, then having obsessive thoughts about certain things is something that can happen. And there are treatments there are medications that can help with that. There are psychological treatments that can help with that. So I would encourage somebody to see their GP, and if the GP turns out to be not particularly sympathetic, which sometimes happens, go and see another GP and keep going until you find a good one. Even I, as a doctor, had to see a couple of people before I found the right person for me. And one slight point that I was going to make in terms of medications is sometimes what the doctor will try with you first as a first line won't work. I took 3 goes before I found the right medication for me, which was a bit of a slog. because you have to wait for it to kick in. And then when it didn't kick in, we went, right, okay, let's try something else. So it is a journey. So certainly from that point of view, I would try to seek that out, even if you've done it before and it hasn't worked. You know, keep going back if it isn't helping. Certainly there are really good GPs who have got a lot of training in mental health and are good.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, unfortunately with this, I mean, as Emma said, there's a wee bit of trial and error involved in medication, and also actually even with the doctor or the counsellor that you work with. And it's not necessarily the counsellor's fault, the doctor's fault. It's just something you click with people better than other people. It's nobody's fault that sometimes you need to try it as another person. So I mean, I'd echo that too. I mean, particularly from a counselling perspective, you know, if somebody comes to see me for counselling, I will always say to them, if this is not working for you, if we're not connecting with each other, please tell me. Don't come back. Please tell me. There's other people I can refer you on to instead. I'll not be offended if you go and see somebody else. You know, if somebody else can help you better than I can, actually, that's what I want for you. I'll not be offended if you go and see somebody else. So keep trying. And I mean, the other thing is with OCD and anxiety. I mean, as Miriam said, I mean, they do tend to be defense mechanisms we put in place to protect ourselves. But then you think of anxiety as a whole. I mean, anxiety, I always describe anxiety to people as basically our protection for life. And it feels like your enemy, but it's your friend. And I will spend a lot of time from somebody particularly with anxiety, helping them to understand anxiety, how it works, you know, what happens in the brain when it happens, and I'll not go through all this stuff here tonight. I mean, there's because I haven't got several sessions to do this on, but simply, I mean, very, very basically, what happens when you get anxious, your prefrontal cortex switches off, medial brain switches on, the limbic region of the brain switches on, adrenaline rushes through your body, your brain shouts danger, danger, danger. And it's your protection for life. So it's your friend, it's protecting you, but it feels like your enemy. And very often the anxiety that we feel today, unless there's an obvious reason why you feel anxious today, very often it's linked to something in the past. And I need to spend some time with somebody to find out what that is, which I'm not going to obviously do tonight. But those are sort of very, very general things. The other thing too is, when it comes to sort of habits and OCD and behavior stuff, we don't want to simply say to you, stop doing it, because it is protecting you. We want to work through why it's there and very, very gently just change it. We're talking about subtle changes, wee bit at a time. You know, I often say to people, and from a counselling perspective, we want to change maybe one thing in your life every month. Just one little thing, you know, it might be just, you know, having breakfast in the morning, for example. Or maybe next month we're adding in going for a short walk once a week. You know, we're doing very, very subtle, small changes to try and just make over a period of time that gradual change to a person's life. Yeah, say a lot more, but stop talking.
If I can just chime in. When so I, with my depression, there was an element of OCD in terms of compulsive negative thoughts, you know, certainly surrounding suicide and all that kind of stuff. And again, as a Christian, my response, well, eventually it was pointed out to me that I'm not using the weapon that I have, which is prayer, and so when I had those compulsive thoughts, I, instead of wasting so much of my energy trying to stop those thoughts from occurring, I used them as a trigger for a better behavior. You know, when I thought, you know, maybe I'm better off dead, I in my mind I framed that as, when I get that thought, that is the starting pistol for me praying in tongues, and I'm gonna do that until I don't feel like killing myself anymore. And sometimes anchoring a positive behavior to a negative trigger, to a negative behavior, so you turn that from that negative thought from the end game into a starting pistol for something better. And that is a tactic that I found really, really helpful.
That's helpful, Dave, because that's actually what I was going to say. So, like, I think just bringing in this idea that actually, like, we can, alongside having negative feelings or OCD, we can start to build still, although, like Colin said, perhaps slowly over time, positive habits, which begin to produce different feelings and emotions and so on over time. And so it's getting that balance, and you have to know where that person is in that kind of walk, who's got this anxiety or OCD. But I think there's definitely a place for saying that we, as creatures, actually, we build habits all the time, habits of mind, patterns of thought, patterns of living, and so on. And coming alongside and offering actually like a real positive, perhaps only in a drip like way, like I've said, a positive set of habits can be really fruitful for moving forward.
As I say, I mean, I found praying in tongues really powerful, because, again, as Emma alluded to before, like, your cognitive function definitely goes downhill when you're in that kind of a state. And so the thought of me praying using words was nonsensical. There was no way I would be able to form coherent sentences to God in prayer when I was in that kind of a state. So if you are someone that speaks in tongues, then that is a real weight lifted, to be able to just pour out your heart without needing words. And if you're not someone that speaks in tongues, then that's okay too. If you're going to struggle to pray, then when you get those thoughts, have a team of people in your corner who you can send a message to, who will pray for you. I had that as well.
Another thing I would say for when I've been in that state is I have a holding cross, which is shaped in the palm of a hand. And again, that's from another Christian tradition. But holding on to that was like, it was not a substitute for prayer, it was a prayer, because I could kind of form some sort of thoughts, but I couldn't really do that much. I'm just seeing Lydia appearing.
Sorry, yes, Lydia's just like his face.
His face just appears, bless her. So that's another thing that, when things were really difficult, that is another thing. Before I spoke into, because I speak in tongues now, but at the time I didn't. So that was a really powerful thing as well.
I think finding those, I call them wells, but those places of refreshment. So times when I've compulsively been thinking negative things over a sustained period of time, even if it's reluctantly, even if it's just that I've just made the choice, just one choice. I haven't often expected anything to change as a result, but I've made a choice to say, okay, I'm going to listen to this person, or I go to a book or a poem or a song or something which I know beforehand wasn't feeling that way, was really helpful. It was a well, in other words, it was a place of nourishment. And again, although at the time I shaped it in a profoundly negative way, it turns out that just by making that choice, it was a bit like a crack of light coming through a wall. And it's sometimes only a very small crack, and it's only a small amount of light, but it's there. And I've found that actually that it was those moments of just making that choice, and having people force me sometimes to make a positive choice. People who are around me who love me and know me, saying, you know what you need to do, you know where you need to go. That was helpful. Again, it comes back to that. Just I wasn't in that state. I know, Emma, we've talked, and you mentioned about people who are completely unable or numb to make any kind of decision. So I'm not talking about when we're there, but if we're not, there does remain a capacity to choose, even if it's a small amount. And I think maintaining that is really key to this discussion as well.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important, and it links back to what Colin was saying earlier about how you could tailor CBT to to kind of replace these negative thoughts with solid biblical truth. So I'm just looking at the time, and I'm afraid time has defeated us. Colin, I'm aware you've not spoken for a little bit. So do you have any final thoughts before we close off?
Leave us with profundity.
Yes. No pressure, but it all hangs on you.
I was just going to say, I've no other thoughts there, but I feel under pressure to say something important.
Hey, we don't want to cause any anxiety. So, look, guys, it's been so great to have you. Thank you so much to our panel this evening, Matt Banks, Emma Beddoes, Colin Cooper. As ever, we're not claiming to have solved anything this evening. This is a conversation that is going to continue. And if there is anything that's come out of this evening that you'd like to follow up with us about, please do send us a message. Please do get in contact. I think the email address is nfchester@gmail.com. I think that's off the top of my head. I'm sure Keith.
I think Keith was shaking his head there.
Okay, Keith, unmute yourself and.
nfchester@me.com.
There we go. There we go.
Go to the website. The details are on the website. So
yes,
we need that as a jingle.
We do. nfchester@me.com. We'll get it recorded. We'll have it next time. But yes, so I'm going to let you guys go. I can see the numbers are already starting to drop off as England has now kicked off. But thank you so much for coming along. And for those who are watching the recording, thank you for sticking with us to the end. Bless you guys, and may the Lord bless you and keep you and grant you good mental health.